embolsados en Pokrovsk.
Encircled in Pokrovsk. In the last few hours, the Russian armed forces have carried out an almost complete encirclement of the strategic city of Pokrovsk. More than 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers appear trapped in this pocket, facing a total, absolute dilemma: surrender or death. How will Ukraine's political and military leaders in Kyiv respond? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 284 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship. On the other side of the screen, and across the Atlantic Ocean, from Madrid, Spain, we are joined by Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are things over there?
Here, in old and decaying Europe, we are on alert. NATO forces say they are going to respond and send their troops to defeat the Russians on the Ukrainian plains and steppes. I mention this because the latest foolishness, or rather, the second to last, since you never know when the last one will come, comes from none other than the Belgian Minister of Defense. What did this man say? Well, he said the following: if Russia attacks the capital of a NATO member state, the alliance will raze Moscow to the ground. As we all know, yes indeed, Belgium has always been a great power. In fact, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans are all extraordinarily afraid of it. And as a point of reference, in World War II, it took 18 days to capitulate to the German forces, which is a record. So, well, this superpower allows itself to say that it's going to destroy Moscow down to its foundations. This is Europe. Welcome to Europe, and to the dysfunctionality of our leaders, who are in another galaxy.
That said, it's because there's going to be, yes, they're in panic. Before starting the military analysis, and by the way, today, we're basically going to present the analysis of the military situation in Ukraine. Also, of course, we're going to analyze the upcoming meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, which will take place tomorrow, both already in Seoul, the South Korean capital. But first, I wanted to start with a very, very big thank you. A huge thank you to the Demolidores and Demolidoras from yesterday, who joined me at the Demolidores gathering here in Buenos Aires at El Pulqui Bar. A total success, Fernando. The place was packed. Very nice spot. We were also joined by Eduardo Vior. The conversation was very, very interesting. A great back and forth. Truly spectacular. So from now on, that's our meeting point here in Buenos Aires. Many thanks to them, and in just a few hours, I'll be able to share the photos and videos online. That said, dear Fernando, help us out a bit with today's convention.
Well, yes, for the meeting, but not for Argentina's situation. But okay, let's see. The Milei issue. Then, since I'm over here on the other side and not really following, can you give me a quick rundown of your point of view on how this man keeps winning or getting good results? I mean, it's something that leaves those of us who know a lot about Argentine politics completely astonished. But anyway.
Yes, for the experts too. But anyway, Fernando, the situation on the front. Where do we start?
At the front. Well, how are things? As I said, as you can see, the Westerners are in panic mode, understandably, and especially the Europeans in panic mode because they see that all this is speeding up. In fact, what we're seeing this October, which is already coming to an end, is that the Russians' advance has accelerated noticeably across all parts of the front, some more than others. But in the case of Pokrovsk, we can say it now, right? This time I'm not mistaken, and if I am, fine, I'll resign. No, but here we really can say it given the critical situation Pokrovsk is in, and that is that Pokrovsk is about to fall. Mind you, as we can see on the map, Pokrovsk is actually two cities, what we call Pokrovsk itself and Mirnorod, I always say it wrong, which is a city that runs parallel, almost right next to Pokrovsk.
Bueno, pues lo que es Pokrovsk como tal
Well, as for Pokrovsk itself, there's practically very little left. That is, they've already moved into the northern area, as you can see here, in gray. This gray area is more or less under control. They've crossed the railway lines, and what remains are small sectors in the gray zone, which is just a matter of time. In fact, the bottleneck of the Pokrovsk encirclement has been shrinking and is now around 2 kilometers wide. That is, yesterday, apparently at night, some units managed to get out across the fields, since there are no roads left, good or bad, but that was individually and so on. Even so, there are still many people trapped inside. So what's happening? As you can see here, the Russians are also advancing in Mirnohrad, I never quite remember. That is, both from the north and from the east. And right now the city is already considered lost, both cities. To the point that what we're seeing is that, on one hand we have Zelensky, and Zelensky is doing his own thing as if nothing were happening. I mean, of course, sure, everything's going fine and so on. That's Zelensky's official line. But obviously, he's figuring out how to present the disaster to Ukrainian citizens, to Europeans, and to the world, and how to sell it. He'll probably say what he usually does. No, well, that wasn't important, and so on. Deep down, it was a secondary city and all that, and well, we'll recover it in the future. That's more or less what they'll tell us. But for now, they're keeping quiet. The one who does seem to be doing something is General Syrsky, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, and he has gone to the vicinity of the area to try, let's say, to mitigate the disaster. Look, for the head of the Ukrainian army himself to have to go to the region, to the area, things must be really bad. And what are the Ukrainians doing? As I said, they've lost Pokrovsk. Well, what they're doing is concentrating as many units as possible, but already in desperation, with cutbacks. That is, if we pull a company from here, another battalion from there, half a regiment from who knows where, we bring it here. In short, a hodgepodge of units from wherever they can. Not even to prevent the fall of Pokrovsk anymore, but to try to establish a defensive line that doesn't exist. That's why they have to create a new one, some distance from Pokrovsk, to slow down the Russian advance. Because as soon as Pokrovsk falls and they clear out the units that are trapped there, etc., and the situation stabilizes, the next step will be an advance toward the west, which they're already doing in other sectors. That is, they're already doing it, for example, in Dnipro and Zaporizhia. We'll talk about that later. But an advance toward the west because, let's remember, beyond Pokrovsk there's nothing. When I say nothing, I mean there's nothing left of the large defensive system that the Ukrainians had been building since 2014. All those lines of bunkers, trenches, minefields, and so on. All those major defensive lines, this is the last one. In other words, beyond this point, it's practically open ground. From there on, everything becomes much easier for the Russians. Even in this season, there's already rain and all that. But the Ukrainians have nothing. Among other reasons, because, in addition, the money that was given to many of these commanders in different sectors, Ukrainian commanders, to build trench lines, fortifications, and so on, they just pocketed it and did nothing. So now they're going to find themselves facing what we've seen in the usual terrain of this whole large area of central Ukraine. Vast farmland, more or less rectangular in shape, bordered since Soviet times by lines of trees, which are the only places where one can take cover, just to give an idea. But it's a small area, with much lower population density. No big cities, only small towns, and that's important. And there's no real front line. Let me explain. While up until now there was more or less a front line, meaning a greater or lesser concentration of Ukrainians in different areas, that's no longer the case. What we have here are small Ukrainian units spread across different villages. but without any real connection or anything like that. That's what's allowing the Russians to advance very quickly. Again, always in the context of a positional war, a war of attrition where progress is very limited. On top of that, as we're seeing in the videos Ezekiel is showing us, there's the added factor of drone warfare. Moving anywhere near the front line right now is almost suicidal, because we're seeing drone after drone after drone.
Estamos viendo drones y drones y drones. Yo por ahí tengo un vídeo en el que, además de la zona de Pokrovsk,
I actually have a video from the Pokrovsk area where you can see the airspace, and you see a swarm, not a swarm in the military sense, but a swarm like flies, wasps, or bees. In other words, there are drones buzzing all over the place. It's just impossible. The area is saturated with drones. If we add to that the fact that, for example, even today Mirhorod, this city parallel to Pokrovsk, was still being bombed with Fab 500 bombs, 500-kilo glide bombs, half a ton each, and that the artillery keeps pounding, especially that bottleneck. Well, the situation is already desperate.
La situación es ya desesperada. Es decir, como bien señalaba Ezequiel, o te rindes.
That is to say, as Ezekiel Bistoletti rightly pointed out, either you surrender or we finish you off. There are no other options here. This is going to be key, as I said. After the capture of Pokrovsk, we're going to see a major Russian advance, both to the west and to the north. Look at how desperate the Ukrainians were. They threw everything they could in there to hold the Pokrovsk pocket for as long as possible. But there comes a point when they just can't hold it anymore. They even tried, if we remember back in early August, when the Russians managed to make a push northward and reached a key road. Well, they've been working to undo all of that, bringing in units, basically pulling them from anywhere they can, however they can. In fact, they've already done it. In the latest map updates I've been looking at, they've practically achieved it already, but it doesn't matter anymore. I mean, that problem is now irrelevant, because the fall of Pokrovsk will allow the Russians to advance toward the two major remaining cities, also close together, side by side, but from the rear. This is key. They're going to encircle them from behind. There's still some time before that happens. This is, let's say, anticipating what's going to happen, but not much. As we'll see later, almost the entire front line is in critical condition. We'll see it in Kupiansk, we'll see it in Lyman itself, we'll see it in, what's it called? I can't remember right now. I'll copy it below because almost all of them are already fighting inside the cities. That is, we'll do a more thorough review in a moment. But the main thing, the key idea, is that Pokrovsk is about to fall. It's even possible, very likely, that today, Wednesday, by next Sunday, when Ezekiel and I are here talking again, we'll already be talking about the fall of Pokrovsk, that it will have already fallen.
Fernando, in your opinion, how many people are currently encircled in Pokrovsk, and how many are encircled in Kupiansk?
Let's see, if we go by what General Gerasimov told us a few days ago, then between 5,000 and 5,500 in each of them, a total of about 10,000 or 11,000. That's what Gerasimov told us. There are other sources that say it's fewer, probably because you can't fit that many people there either. I mean, they're not such big cities. And what we're seeing right now is that the battles, if we can call them that, the captures, the attacks and counterattacks from both sides, especially in urban environments, are carried out with very small numbers, both for defense and for attack. Right now, as we mentioned the other day, the Russians, for example, are using groups. The term groups should almost be taken as a joke, because I don't know what can really be called groups. They're using groups of 4 or 2 soldiers. That is, 2 soldiers alone, who obviously have orders and know where they need to go. They advance to a certain position, another 4 advance to another 2 move forward. In fact, when the Russians were advancing inside Pokrovsk, there was talk of infiltrations that in total reached the railway line. They haven't taken the station and are advancing further north and so on, with about 200 soldiers, 200 or 250 soldiers, because anything else would be suicide. And of course, those 200 soldiers are very spread out from each other. This is what's changing the drone war.
Esto es lo que está cambiando la guerra de drones. La guerra de drones está revolucionando la guerra.
The drone war is revolutionizing warfare, and that's just how it is. Right now, there are two countries that are far ahead of the rest in this field, even ahead of major powers like China or the United States. Those are Ukraine and Russia, because they have combat experience that only they possess. To what extent is it true that right now the NATO folks, specifically the Europeans, are bringing in, and this is officially confirmed, Ukrainian drone operators to teach them how drone warfare works? They're in Denmark, they're in many European countries. In other words, this is public. It's no secret, because they don't know. In fact, Ukrainians complain that the drones they make themselves, because they build them both in factories that are often bombed and in small family workshops, meaning in a house, almost inside the house, where they keep the car and so on. Well, they've developed some drone technologies. Although many of the drones they build use components that come from other countries, they assemble them, experiment, and design new models that are far superior to European drones. As a result, they complain that the drones Europeans make on their own are not very effective on the battlefield, because they're pretty lousy.
Speaking of drones, Fernando, here the sending indeed of a drone with pamphlets, with, yes, what should we call it? Yes, pamphlets.
Yes, leaflets they're dropping. Surrender.
Indeed, with the announcement of the situation and the offer of surrender or the ruthless Russian advance. This, in Kupiansk, Fernando, in Kupiansk, in addition to further advances in part of the city, also here a penetration that once again creates a clear forcing, right?
Indeed, here we have the Oskil River, which is crucial because the advance from the north divides the city of Kupiansk into two sides, right? One, the larger side, which is the one we see in red, where the Russians are advancing, and the other, the smaller part, which is on the other side. Well, the western part, which we see in red, where the Russians are advancing, the larger part, is practically conquered already. There's a small area left to the south, but it's considered lost. There's nothing to be done here. And as I said, it's practically conquered. Then most likely, by next week at the latest, the Russians will finish occupying the western part. Of course, as we said, the river that runs through the city of Kupiansk continues southward and is already causing everything shown in yellow to be encircled, because there are no bridges left.
Queda embolsado, porque ya no hay puentes de aquí a la siguiente parte controlada por los rusos.
From here to the next area controlled by the Russians. There, as Ezekiel points out along this red line, that is to say, the pontoon bridges the Ukrainians are trying to set up are destroyed immediately. As a result, all the units here are in practice encircled because they have the river behind them and can't cross it. In fact, this attempt we see here is an effort to further divide this pocketed area, that is, into two parts. This will also be considered lost by the Ukrainian troops, even if they don't say so publicly. But anyway, this will be written off by the Ukrainian High Command, because it's indefensible. Well, we're going to see this fall before long. We'll have a November Friday when one city after another will fall, as we'll see.
For everyone in this area of the river, Fernando, it looks like a swampy territory, like a delta, so they can't even cross the river in one go. Instead, they have to travel kilometers through rivers, streams, and swamps. It's practically impenetrable without a proper bridge.
Yes, yes, yes. No, no. I mean, getting in there, especially now that we're in the rainy season and all with those huge mudslides in Ukraine, well, that's it. Between the rivers, streams, swamps, and the massive mud pits that must be forming already, there's no way through. We're talking about soldiers only. Don't even think about sending in a vehicle. That wouldn't even cross their minds, because it wouldn't make it 20 meters. So, well, this is a hard blow because, moreover, if we go further north, we'll see that one of the things that has happened is a bridgehead that was formed in Kharkiv here. And it's already connected with this area, because all of this is Kharkiv. This whole region is Kharkiv. No, higher up. Higher up.
Todo esto es la región de Kharkov. No, más arriba. Arriba del todo de la frontera entre Ucrania y...
All the way up, on the border between Ukraine and there we'll see. Well, this is now connected. That is, this bridgehead was established, they advanced eastward, or, in other words, all of this is now linked. So what we're seeing is that once Kupiansk, since the Russians have been advancing through here, the cities further north of Volchansk, or Bolchansk depending on how you look at it, which is also in Kharkiv, are about to fall. There's almost nothing left of the city. A city that's been fought over, if I remember correctly, for a year and 7 months. That's saying something. This one is... Look, if you zoom out, we'll see here. There it is. This is about to fall. The only thing left is this. Look there in an area next to it. This here. Well, this city has been devastated. I mean, there aren't 2 stones left together, but this is all they have left. The Russians have already taken almost the entire city, and from there, they're going to advance. So, if we zoom out, we can see that a major advance is taking shape in Kharkiv. From here to here, at the far tip up there, there's also a village captured by the Russians. Here, the Kupiansk area. In other words, a battlefield is being formed so they can break through from all these points and take over this whole area. In a situation where, as we've said many times, Ezekiel and I have been saying this for a year and a half now. I don't even remember anymore, I've lost count. The big problem the Ukrainians have is manpower. They don't have people. That is, there just aren't any.
They're going to abandon it here, Fernando, practically without any fighting, because this is countryside, basically. That's it, countryside. Nothing there. Nothing. This is indefensible. Open field.
That's right. I mean, so as I said, we'll start to see how the Russians are taking back much of what they lost in 2022 in the Kharkiv region. And as I said, right now we have the Ukrainians, that is, the political and military leaders, in panic mode. Look, there's a man speaking. What do you think he's talking about?
There's the destruction of a dam by the Ukrainians in this area here. Further up, clearly in anticipation of the situation. Here, the destruction of the dam, this one on the Donetsk River. Further up, clearly anticipates the situation described by Fernando as a kind of natural barrier against capture. And notice that Kharkiv...
The capital, Kharkiv, isn't very far. I'm not saying they're going to enter Kharkiv. They're not. But let's say if they take this whole area, there's Kharkiv. It's within a stone's throw and within range of FABs and artillery. We'll see, because the situation is getting much more complicated, mainly because of that. Because they have to cover many sectors of the front at the same time and don't have enough troops. So, that's important too.
Fernando, with this situation, before long, we're going to witness, finally, in this region, that has resisted so strongly against the Ukrainian defense, the capitulation of the defenses, and a very significant territorial advance in depth. How will Western media and Western leaders present it, after months and months and years of the Russians making no territorial gains, appearing stalled, and suddenly taking an entire bite out of a quarter of Ukraine? How will they frame it for the public?
a conceptualizar para el público, porque ya cada
Pues
vez es más difícil.
algunos no saben, claro.
Some no longer know how to present it. Others still keep saying the Ukrainians are going to win. Well, look, if everyone wants to live in their own imaginary world, I mean, they don't really know how to present it. They'll fall back on the usual excuses. Well, these are territorial gains that aren't important. The Ukrainian army still has plenty of room to maneuver. They can recruit more people. In fact, they're already saying that, even though they never managed to do it. But anyway, they keep talking, especially the Poles and the Germans, about how there are lots of people here, many young Ukrainians who will run off, that they must be sent back no matter what. It's very easy to say, but very hard to do. Well, they'll tell us any story saying that, well, in practice, they're already doing it. But legally, the Ukrainians will have to lower the mobilization age to 18. They won't have any other choice. And they're already mobilizing women. I mean, men aren't enough. So now it's not just volunteers and so on, but they're more or less encouraging. It's not mandatory, but they're encouraging women to sign up. In other words, they don't have enough personnel. It's a demographic problem, about 20 million or so.
If I remember correctly, Fernando, not long ago, due to pressure from Ukrainian society and Western media, Zelensky enacted a permit allowing Ukrainians up to 22 years old to leave the country, just like those under 18. If I'm not mistaken, that happened recently. Until then, Ukrainian boys up to 18 years old could leave Ukraine, which led to a massive exodus of young people aged 17 in a few months. Pressure from Western media, civil society, and Ukrainian society itself led to that exception. Well, now, those up to 22 years old can also leave Ukraine, and a massive exodus of young men aged 18 to 22 began. If they now decide to mobilize those people, they still won't be able to significantly increase the armed forces' manpower, because those young men have already left Ukraine.
Sure, but even if there were many, these are people who, as you rightly said, have either abandoned it or want to abandon it. So their, let's say, combat capacity is minimal, if not non-existent. In other words, what they're going to do is what we're seeing. People who are forcibly recruited run away as soon as they can. That is, they take off because they feel they don't belong there. This doesn't interest me. As for fighting for Zelensky, well, that's not going to happen. So, well, I mean, no matter how much they recruit, there's an insoluble demographic problem. And we shouldn't forget that when statistics come out, among those of military age, there are... I read one, though I'm not sure if it was true or not. Of military age right now, Ukraine can still mobilize 1,700,000. I don't know if it's at 700,000 or 2 million or 3 or 4. But that's not true. I mean, because look, you have to maintain the basic structure of the state. I mean, I can't just say, come on, these firefighters, let's mobilize them. Those working in hospitals, let's mobilize them. The minimal bureaucracy that any state needs to function has to be maintained. I mean, it doesn't work that way, and we've seen that in the world wars. The number of people who can actually be mobilized is much smaller than the number of people of mobilizable age.
Now, they think they have a solution for that. Do you remember the billboard and advertising campaigns in Kiev saying migrants welcome? With that, they send young Ukrainian men to their deaths, into the meat grinder, and in their place, in their fantasy, obviously unrealizable, they call in people from Bangladesh. To what extent could a young man from Bangladesh, a migrant from Bangladesh,
doing the work of a Ukrainian electrician? Impossible. Let's see. Even in Bangladesh, they know there's a war in Ukraine, and it's not exactly the favorite destination for Bangladeshis. I mean, they have plenty of other places to go if they want to emigrate. It's delusional. They have to make things up now. because they need to cover up the disaster that the war in Ukraine has already become for them. And just wait for the winter they're going to have. Mind you, we're seeing it every day. Ukrenergo, which is Ukraine's energy company, and energy experts, etc., are telling us, no, look, especially in the eastern part, we'll talk about that too, from the Dnipro toward Russia. To put it simply, the recent bombings have been concentrated mainly in depth across Ukraine, targeting power plants, refineries, oil depots, and so on, including Kharkiv. In other words, as you rightly pointed out with the reservoir, the power plants in the Kharkiv region are being wiped out.
Las centrales eléctricas en la región de Kharkov están siendo laminadas. Claro, porque evidentemente es mucho más fácil avanzar.
Of course, because obviously it's much easier to move forward if people no longer have any kind of energy. This is important because, well, the first thing that comes to mind when they say, oh, a blackout is, well, we'll be left without light, without electricity. But it's more than that. If it were only that, bad as it is, you'd say they'll be left without water. In fact, they're already having water problems in some places, and with drinking water too. And without electricity, well, you can get by, more or less. I mean, heating, which in Russia is mainly gas, right? And in Ukraine too. Well, if they're destroying the gas storage facilities, they've already said they don't have nearly enough gas for the whole winter. If you run out of gas, well, you cut down trees, there are plenty. Whatever it takes, you bundle up, stay inside your house and survive however you can. But without drinking water, you last about a week, more or less. Human beings without drinking water don't make it past roughly a week. And this is key, because the pumps that move water from one place to another are electric. In other words, if they run out of water, that's it. And all of this is currently in a critical situation, according to the regime's own, let's say, Ukrainian authorities, who are already announcing that there will be outages that, in some cases, could last for days. Days.
What a mystery, Fernando, that the attacks on strategic infrastructure only began 3 years after the war, when in fact, shortly after it started, months later, I remember, they had caused a total and complete blackout. They attacked Ukraine's energy infrastructure, caused a blackout that lasted a few days, and then abandoned that strategy.
This is something incomprehensible. Yes, something incomprehensible from a military point of view. You could look for reasons why they did it, but then we're already beyond the military sphere. That is, the pressure from many oligarchs who had, I don't know how it is now, businesses that went through Ukraine to transport, for example, certain banned products, but which in practice ended up in Europe. There's been a lot of joking about this. I mean, this thing about imposing sanctions, well, it's like what they did with Vegas, where in the end, Europeans buy it through Indians and Chinese, but they're still buying the same Russian gas. The same goes for a bunch of products. I think I remember titanium being mentioned. No, this and that, but it's smuggled through Ukraine. The Ukrainians themselves go along with it because they make money. And in the end, a lot of contraband goods are coming through. And that's the business. Europeans, European companies, Ukrainian ones, and Russian ones. I mean, there's been a lot of that too. Putin has been cracking down as much as he could on all the corruption that existed. That's another thing. Even within the military, with the eventual replacement of Sergei Shoigu as Minister of Defense by Belousov, because Shoigu and his circle were corrupt. This has been proven. And as for the others, the first thing they had to do was clean house. And some, well, quite a few ended up in prison for corruption. So, well, all these things help explain why there were interests that didn't want Ukraine to be left without energy, because it would have ruined their business. But of course, we're talking about people in the elite who are part of Putin's support base. It's not that easy to go after them and say, no, I'm taking this one out. That could be one of many possible reasons. But there's a fundamental difference between what happened with Surovikin when Surovikin began to de-electrify Ukraine, and what's happening now. Back then, what they did was attack substations and repeaters, so to speak. In other words, through repeated strikes and attacks, the power plant in question would eventually stop working. Now they're directly attacking the power plants themselves, which amounts to the same thing. In fact, one of the things that the harder line Russian side, the most hardline sector, is demanding is that, for example, there has been a lot of outrage over the attack on a hydroelectric plant in the Belgorod region of Russia, where they attacked for 2 or 3 days and managed to break part of the sluice gates, causing water to spill out. Well, in response to that, there has been a lot of pressure for the Russians to respond with extreme force. And in fact, what the Russians have been doing in the case of hydroelectric plants is destroying the electrical part, not the dam itself, but the facilities, whereas they don't blow up the dam, which is what the Ukrainians do when they can. That is to say, there was pressure to say, hey, no, stop the nonsense. What's this nitpicky thing about only hitting the engine section and not touching the dam? No, that can be repaired. Blow up the dam so it can't be repaired anymore. Even so, the process they're carrying out, especially in the eastern part, as I said, has many problems right now. And even Kiev, the capital, is going to face major blackouts this winter. This winter is going to be very harsh. And as we were just talking about, I don't know if you have the map there, because I'd like to explain something. Let's go, because this is important. Let's go to the Dnipropetrovsk area and the border with Zaporizhia. That area is the one where they're advancing the fastest, because there they no longer have what we mentioned before about the big lines and all that, which now with Pokrovsk is going to collapse. But look here, this thing we see here, this sort of vanguard that has taken several small villages just today. Here we see a road in yellow, a lighter shade. That northern road, where does it go? To Huliaipol. They're about 4 kilometers away from reaching it. The moment they cut this off, they'll deal a heavy blow to Huliaipol, which is the main defense center in Zaporizhia, in the eastern part of the Russian-controlled area of Zaporizhia. But they're also advancing through Zaporizhia. Practically only Uspenivka remains. All the villages that formed a kind of artificial barrier one behind another have been overtaken, and from there they're also going to advance from Zaporizhia in the north to enter Huliaipol from the north. In other words, this is going to fall sooner than it seems, because this is exactly what we were talking about before. What the Russians are encountering are villages with just a few Ukrainian soldiers. They take them, move on to the next village, and so on, moving relatively quickly. This sector, which is already in Dnipropetrovsk, and this is important, is now going to advance after the fall of Pokrovsk and Dnipropetrovsk very rapidly, and also toward the north. They're going to head toward Pokrovsk. That is something different from Pokrovsk. It's a small village, but it's a crossroads. There we have it. It's a strategically important crossroads, as you can see, because roads come in from the north, south, east, and west. So that's where they're heading, and they'll cut it off in relatively little time, since these advances are already quite fast due to the lack of Ukrainian resistance. Let's say a solid or even moderately solid defense. So we're going to have a very eventful November. But look how things stand. Let me not forget. There it is. Look at the distance. If you measure, since you're an expert at gauging distances from the edge to the road, well, the last time I read about it, it was about 4 kilometers, but it might even be less.
Let's see what we get. If the tool helps me. About 2.89 kilometers, 3 kilometers.
Look, 3 kilometers. I mean, that's nothing now. Let's see what falls. There's a small village that doesn't really pose major problems for the Russians. Well, in the next few days, by this Sunday at the latest, we'll surely be talking about how it's fallen.
And over here, also a river to the right, Fernando, which means they're even covered by the upper field. So this advance, it's fast, this is going to move very quickly.
But I didn't want to forget two things that are also important. The Russians are already fighting in Konstantinovka, or Konstantinovka, I never remember the name. That is to say, they've entered and are already fighting in the southern part of the city. There's still a way to go. Konstantinovka is a large city, but they're already inside, already fighting, and that's important. There have been substantial advances, and we're going to see a major battle for Konstantinovka in November or December. You see here it's already, they've moved in, and there's a gray zone that covers this southern part of Konstantinovka, and they're already clashing there. The reconnaissance and sabotage units are even operating deeper in. But let's remember, a month or two ago, Liman, the famous city of Liman, we saw it still far away and all that. It's no longer far, they're already fighting inside Liman. That is, they've also entered from the western side.
A military question, but also a political one. Because in reality, Pokrovsk appears on the verge of its collapse, its decline. The Russians will soon conquer it, and Upyansk as well. Just recently in Dnipropetrovsk, we witnessed the situation in Uliapol, almost completely isolated, with that road cut off. The advances toward Konstantinivka are already beginning. What situation will we be in when the Russians conquer all this, if by then no agreement has been reached? If the Ukrainians, backed by Europe and the United States, reject Russia's demands, what will begin from that point on? Will Russia halt its advances because it has already conquered Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Dnipropetrovsk? Or will Putin decide what to do, given that the Ukrainians refused an agreement? Then we accelerate even more, and from now on, we want new things.
Aceleramos aún más y a partir de ahora queremos cosas nuevas.
I think it's clear. Putin has said it many times, and they made it clear in the famous points they presented last year in June. There are a series of points that, until the Ukrainians accept them, real negotiations won't begin. This is non-negotiable. Not joining NATO, demilitarization. I mean, we already know all this. All of it has to be accepted. Otherwise, there won't be real negotiations. We can put on a show, like they did in Istanbul and so on. Well, fine. If it's to keep Trump happy, okay? But there won't be real negotiations. They're not backing down from that. It's one of the reasons Trump said it. Well then fine, let's postpone this. Let's meet with the Russians, with Putin, in Budapest a little later, right? When they've beaten the Ukrainians down even more. What does Trump want? Well, what are we going to find? That either the Ukrainians accept this, or it will go on. And Putin already said it at the time, any territory a Russian soldier steps on becomes part of Russia. Meaning that wherever they are, when the Ukrainians surrender, there will be no concessions, because they're winning. Let's not forget that the one who's winning sets the terms.
Yes, absolutely clear. But it's also clear that for Zelensky, capitulating would mean the end of his political life, and possibly the end of his biological life. So beyond the possibility of the scenario you mentioned, an internal coup, a popular uprising, or an internal political revolt, if somehow Zelensky, as he has done so far, by decapitating his opponents and eliminating those who could take his place, still maintains control of Ukraine when Russia has already conquered all of Donetsk, all of Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, where to then, Fernando? What would be the smartest objective to generate even more pressure from Russia?
They're going to advance, depending on how events unfold, obviously. But the Russians are going to move toward the Dnieper, that is, through Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, toward the city of Zaporizhia and toward Dnipro, the capital of Dnipropetrovsk. That would be the main advance, though not the only one. In other words, why is it easier besides? Because it puts tremendous pressure. And regarding Zelensky, indeed, as you've pointed out, right now the Russians, even if they can't say it, are delighted with Zelensky, because they know that with Zelensky, the Russians' conditions will never be accepted. So, as you rightly pointed out, Zelensky is going to stay in the war as long as he can, until the end, as Boris Johnson would say, until the last Ukrainian. Because the moment the war ends, Zelensky will stop being president. There will be elections or fake elections, I don't care, and they'll get rid of him. And indeed, not only will they get rid of him, they'll probably take him out altogether. All this unless he's taken out in a coup. The more they lose within the regime, the greater the opposition will be, and they'll look for a replacement. Whoever it is, it will probably be more or less agreed upon or directly appointed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on. But as I said, this Zelensky right now is desperate and will hold out as long as he can. If he could hold out for 10 years, he would hold out for 10 years. The thing is, he can't, but he'll go all the way. He has no other option. It's a bit like what happens to Netanyahu, saving, so to speak, the obvious differences, but similar in a way. Netanyahu's alternative is prison. Zelensky's, when the war ends, is basically the cemetery. In other words, they have personal interests in prolonging the wars indefinitely. It doesn't matter, even if the Russians conquer half of Ukraine. We keep fighting. Listen, as long as there are still Ukrainians. Well, the problem is that there's already a faction within what would be the regime, because of course, the real opposition disappeared a long time ago. They're banned, imprisoned, murdered. They don't exist. Let's say the opposition from within the regime, Poroshenko's people, for example, and the rest. They're already at it, looking for a plan B, trying to position themselves and get rid of Zelensky. We'll see. But they're already in a situation where they realize something has to change. Or, as the saying goes, everything must change so that nothing changes. That was from The Leopard, I think. Well, they need to do something like that. Stage a coup, pull one of those moves to keep the business going. Because ultimately these people are corrupt and are becoming billionaires from the war. But anyway, right now what we're going to see is growing desperation in Europe. Europe is in panic mode, not knowing what to do. And this is dangerous because considering that the current European Union is led by the most unhinged ones, the Baltics, the Poles, the Nordics, well, anything is possible, right? We have a Prime Minister of Denmark saying, no, we have to fight this to the end and so on. And whatever it takes, if we have to leave people without pensions, without unemployment benefits, it doesn't matter. Without education, without health care, then so be it. Of course, with these people, well, any nonsense is possible, especially since in that state of desperation, they might decide to carry out some kind of escalation that would be such a big provocation for the Russians that it would force them to do something. The second to last issue, which the Lithuanians have brought up again, and partly the Poles too, is the corridor that connects, I can never remember the name, the corridor that connects Kaliningrad with Belarus, and then from Belarus to Russia and so on. This corridor, which is called something like Suwalki, was agreed upon from the very beginning after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the railway connecting it to Belarus, as well as the road, would be in a way neutral, and that the Russians could pass through there without any problem, without customs, without a border. Just so we understand how things stand. Well, now they're once again bringing up the idea of taking that over so the Russians can't reach Kaliningrad. leaving Kaliningrad isolated, like an island there between the Lithuanians and the Poles. The Russians would take that very badly, to put it mildly. In fact, there was already an attempt at the beginning of the war, a proposal from those shameless people, and the Russians said that if they did that, they'd find out what it meant. And the Lithuanians quickly backed down, and the Poles said, well, we won't close it. But there was an attempt to close it, and the Russians said, either you open it or we're going to crush you. I mean, I bring it up as an example that these lunatics can come up with any kind of operation, whether here in the Baltics or even in the, well, now they're already, it goes back a long way, but they're increasingly operating in the Nordic area, in the Arctic, or in the waters around the Arctic, also trying to block the exit of Russian ships from Murmansk through the Arctic, and so on. Well, all these provocations can get out of hand at any moment, and then who's going to stop it? By the way, what we have here too is that Trump, well, we'll talk about Trump later, because there's a lot to say about Trump. Well, anyway, I mean, today he pulled a troll move. I don't know if I've mentioned it, maybe not. Putin pulled a troll move there at a press conference and all, saying that he had spoken with the generals in command of Pokrovsk and so on about the encirclement at the Pokrovsk site. And that, as the Ukrainians and Western information sources are saying, no, that it's not that bad and it's not going to fall or anything, that he spoke with the generals, they told him there's no problem, and that Western journalists can go in for 4 to 6 hours if they want, that they'll stop the fighting in that area so they can go in and interview a few soldiers, Ukrainians, or whoever they want, so they can see that the situation is indeed critical. It really is a troll move. I mean, there you have it, look.
And besides, this here, dear Fernando, today, just a few days after the announcement of a test with the Burevestnik missile, the Eternal missile, as we call it here, the nuclear-powered missile, not only with nuclear capability, but with nuclear propulsion. Today Putin, accompanied by officers, made an announcement regarding one of the so-called miracle weapons. That's how they would describe them in the West. In Russia, they call them super weapons. The announcement is as follows. Yesterday, we conducted a test of another promising complex, the unmanned underwater vehicle Poseidon, which also has a nuclear power unit on board. I didn't remember this, by the way. There is nothing in the world like the Sarmat, but Poseidon far surpasses Sarmat in power.
Poseidón supera con creces al Sarmat en potencia, además, en cuanto a velocidad y profundidad de movimiento.
Moreover, in terms of speed and depth of movement, this unmanned vehicle has no equal in the world and is unlikely to appear anytime soon, and there is no way to intercept it. Nothing more, nothing less. Just as a reminder, this submarine vehicle, as presented by Putin, in a way represents a giant torpedo with nuclear propulsion, with an internal nuclear reactor, obviously, for its propulsion, and with such nuclear capacity that it could, among other things, generate an underwater explosion off the coast of a country, the United Kingdom, and trigger a land tsunami that would practically wipe out the United Kingdom. That's right. Now, it's clearly designed with the United States in mind. The James Bond movie, Fernando, in this case, is not a coincidence, but rather this possibility appears in practice with a characteristic weapon.
In fact, the submarine that carries it is already operational, and they showed it to us at the time. Look, they launched it, the usual thing. That is, well, let's imagine a large nuclear-powered submarine that carries underneath, attached, not inside, but attached underneath, this huge torpedo, which is enormous. I don't remember how long it is, but it's nuclear-powered, and moves at an enormous speed. Very fast for a torpedo that travels, obviously, through a medium like water, which has more friction, and so on. And it has a 100 megaton warhead, which is quite remarkable. 100 megatons. Let's remember the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were around 15 or 17 kilotons. This one has a 100 megaton warhead. The idea is, indeed, this is obviously designed against the United States, logically, that it would come along the Atlantic or Pacific coast. You launch the missile detonates before reaching the shore, the nuclear warhead explodes, and causes a monstrous, gigantic tsunami that would devastate, for example, California's Pacific coast and so on. That would leave it a wasteland, with the added problem that the tsunami would be radioactive because it was caused by a nuclear explosion and therefore carries the radiation released by the missile when it exploded. And this is undetectable. I was looking here. It says the warhead would detonate at about 1,600 feet. I don't know, of course, since it's given in English. I mean, well, what I have, I'm not sure how that would translate from feet to meters or something like that, but anyway.
1,600 feet is about 490 meters, more or less.
Yes, more or less. Well, they're helping us there. Yes, because this is, let's see, the thing about the angles, this only happens with the United States and the United Kingdom, basically. I mean, they're the only ones who still keep those old medieval measurement systems and don't use exclusively, like the rest of the world, the metric system.
It's just that normally, almost 500 meters, Fernando, 400. Well, 500 meters is a lot, huh?
Underwater. I mean, it's undetectable, the detonation, that is. Impossible to know. Since it has a nuclear engine, it's a bit like the Burevestnik. You release it, and it can keep circling around for a long time until you decide, now I'll send it. But in the meantime, it can keep sailing for months.
Well, I mean, 100 megatons, the power of the nuclear warhead. 100 megatons.
100 megatons is outrageous.
Sweetie, remember that the prefix kilo denotes the existence of 1,000 of something, for example, kilograms, 1,000 grams, and the prefix mega indicates the existence of 1,000,000 of something. So, several times here, artificial intelligence helped me calculate how many Hiroshima bombs this would represent. Any idea, Fernando?
I don't know, nonsense. I mean, nonsense.
Almost 7,000 Hiroshima bombs.
Terrifying. I think I remember that. Let's see, I'm speaking from memory, and my memory is terrible. The largest nuclear bomb, the biggest nuclear test, was the famous Tsar Bomba, which was carried out in the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, up there in the Arctic and all that, during the Soviet Union era. It was both an experiment and at the same time a show of strength. I think it was 50 megatons, if I remember correctly, just to give us an idea. It's the largest nuclear explosion ever conducted in history, by far. Let's imagine the destructive potential of this torpedo, the Poseidon. Well, the Poseidon is another weapon from the enormous arsenal that Putin is showing us. Indeed, one he can use. And that is making the United States look ridiculous. So they're laughing all over Russia when Trump comes out saying something like, no, but I have a nuclear submarine that I can put next to Russia and all that. And they say, well, put whatever you want. In other words, it's clear that this is already becoming obsolete.
The Tsar Bomba, detonated on October 30th, 1961, Fernando. According to Wikipedia, 50 megatons.
50 megatons, just imagine. I mean, this is double, 50 megatons. And that one was insane. I mean, we're talking about something that had never been done before. Not before, not after. Well, this one is double. This means that if you launch it against, for example, the Pacific coast, from Seattle all the way down to almost Baja California in Mexico, everything there disappears. I mean, it would generate such a tsunami that I don't even know how deep it would be. The tsunami would wipe out all the cities in California, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all of that would be gone. So of course, this is part of that great array of weapons that Putin outlined for us in 2018 and has been gradually showing us since then. And watch out, because it must be that these days Putin is about to unveil or promote this kind of weaponry. There's something less dangerous, but well, it depends on how you look at it too.
Hay una cosa menos peligrosa, pero bueno, depende de cómo se mire también. Lo que están probando, y parece que ya funciona y tal, son los drones.
What they're testing, and it seems it's already worked and all that, are the Doomsday drones, or Judgment Day drones. And what's that? Well, we already knew they've had this for a long time, since the Soviet era, as a form of deterrence. The Soviets, and later the Russians, have what you could call an automatic system, which they call the Doomsday system. That is, the dead hand indeed, which, in the event of an American attack that destroys all of Russia's political and military command centers, there's an automatic system that, based on a series of data it receives, and the fact that it can't contact any of the command centers, let's say, it thinks, in quotes, that Russia has already been wiped out, and that the decision-making capacity for a counterattack has practically disappeared, and it decides to attack and launch all the nuclear weapons available at that moment against its enemy, which is the United States. Well, now they're going a step further and have added Doomsday drones. What are these Doomsday drones? They're regular, fairly small drones, but their job is to provide this system with on-site radiation data from different locations while they're flying. You can have drones flying all the time. In other words, these Doomsday drones are constantly measuring radioactivity across Russian territory, and the moment they detect an increase in radiation, they would alert this Doomsday system that there has been an attack on Russia, and from there it would also be activated. That is to say, they said this at the time. I know the Russians said it, but a long time ago, about 15 years ago, something like that. They warned the Americans, look, gentlemen, back then they were still, let's say, in the early days of artificial intelligence, but we're reaching a very dangerous moment. What is that dangerous moment? The one we're already in, or right on the verge of. The thing is, with the hypersonic systems the Russians or the Chinese have, even the Iranians, in other words, the ones the Americans don't have, well, of course, if they launch a missile like the Armata Mach 20, there's no time. That is, it's not like before, when you had a certain amount of time, little, but some time, to detect a ballistic missile. I mean, it would go up, boom, leave the atmosphere, and then fall back in. Well, I could detect it, and when I detected it, I'd launch mine. Generally, more or less approximately, from the moment you fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, it would rise into the atmosphere, fall, and reach its target in about half an hour. It depends on the systems, but just to give us an idea, about half an hour. Half an hour is a lot of time. Well, it's a lot of time in these cases. Above all, it's enough time for humans, the generals, the politicians, whoever they are, to decide what needs to be done. That's already saved us from a nuclear war several times, hasn't it? The good and correct decisions made by humans, right? Well then, like in the case of Stanislav Petrov, right? We've talked about it here a few times. Thanks to him, we're all alive. So, what's happening now? Well, what's happening now is that I have to react much faster. And that missile they're going to launch at me won't take half an hour, but I don't know, we'd have to do the math, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I no longer have the ability to react. So, who has to react from that point on? What have the Americans been proposing for some time now? Artificial intelligence. And of course, letting artificial intelligence decide whether or not a nuclear attack is being launched by the enemy. It makes the few hairs I have left on my head stand on end. It's already, let's say, frightening enough to have human beings make that decision. But after all, I trust human beings much more than artificial intelligence, which, let's not forget, is still basically nothing. What they're doing is, well, when you talk to experts, or to some of them to be more precise, like López de Montaras here in Spain and so on, they say this thing is dumber than anything else. This thing has very little intelligence. What happens is that it still has brute force and simulates reasoning, but it doesn't really reason. It's not aware that it's reasoning or anything like that. And it's very dangerous to leave certain things in the hands of artificial intelligence, as has already been seen. They've tested it, and it has come to conclusions like, for example, kill this person. Which one? I mean, I have a problem with someone. What are the options? I don't know. Well, the best option is going to be yes, yes, come on. No. Be careful with artificial intelligence.
For me, Fernando, these scenarios create confusion, doubt, disorientation. Because I can understand why Russia wants these weapons as a way to provide security for its population, for its sovereignty, for its country. But I can't understand how Western leaders can appear so lost in their worldview as to start a military offensive against a country in possession of such weapons. How out of touch with reality must you be to launch a military attack against a country that, as a means of defense, developed a nuclear-powered torpedo capable of traveling the seas indefinitely, with a power equivalent to nearly 7,000 Hiroshima bombs, and that would cause a tsunami of radioactive water covering your entire country? What's the logic behind starting a war against this country, and, even more so, carrying out, for example, an operation like the famous Operation Spiderweb? Carrying out a drone operation, attacking precisely Russia's nuclear triad as a provocation, specifically as a provocation so that the Russians might somehow deliberate on activating their nuclear doctrine and effectively respond with one of those nuclear behemoths. What's the point, Fernando? Even the worst of the worst still appears alive as a human being. What level of madness makes these people want the destruction of everything, of everyone, and of themselves as well?
We're talking about people who are really out of their minds, to begin with. The other day I was talking, for example, about a guy like Peter Thiel, the head of Palantir, who right now is one of the most powerful men in the world. And this guy, besides philosophizing about the coming of the Antichrist, which according to him is about to happen, already freaks you out and makes you go, what are you even talking about? This man, for instance, among many other things, goes around saying that the whole free market idea is nonsense and that what must be defended hammer and tongs is monopoly. He actually says that, you know. Monopoly. His monopoly. His own, of course, obviously. But this idea that there should be competition is very bad. But he really says it like that, you know. This goes against business and doesn't make countries prosper through competition. Monopolies. All monopolies. We're talking about people who aren't quite right in the head. But then there are people, and there are plenty of so-called experts, let's say, crazy ones, who are saying, well, you know, with the Russians we're already seeing it and so on. They're not going to do something like unleashing one of those monstrosities and all that. So, if we provoke them, maybe what we can actually cause is that instead of hitting us with a Poseidon or a Burevestnik or something like that, they'll limit themselves to dropping a tactical nuclear bomb. And well, a scenario in Europe where there's a tactical nuclear war, we could stop that, and we wouldn't suffer. This is madness, but it's being updated. I mean, this would have to be on paper and all, written by a lot of people, and they say yes, yes, yes. It's like the idea of low-yield nuclear weapons. And well, if we have low-yield nuclear weapons, meaning very small ones, half a kiloton, for example, we could use them in conventional, normal wars against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, and it would go unnoticed. because neither the Russians nor the Chinese would do anything if we dropped small half-kiloton bombs. I mean, of course, with that logic, if you can call it that, any nonsense becomes viable. And this is the logic of the United States, let's not fool ourselves.
Y esta es la lógica de Estados Unidos, no nos engañemos. Evidentemente, no todos están así, de mal, pero...
Obviously, not everyone is that bad off, but you say, well, the idea that a partial nuclear war could be waged, even that it could be won. Let's not forget that all of this comes as a consequence of the development of the missile defense system. And the missile defense system is based on a delusional premise that I can set up a system to intercept Soviet strategic missiles back then, and now Russian ones, in such a way that practically all the strategic missiles launched at me would be shot down. Maybe one or two would get through, because you're not going to eliminate 100%. But well, if 3 or 4 get through, it's no big deal. And that, therefore, I would have won a nuclear war. Moreover, since the Russians would know that I would win a nuclear war, because my interceptor missiles would eliminate their strategic nuclear attack missiles, they wouldn't even try. That's the logic. It's a very twisted logic that leads to absurd and uncontrollable scenarios. But that's the logic they operate under. And thanks to the fact that the Russians have developed all these kinds of hypersonic systems and so on, the whole missile defense system issue has already become obsolete. It's useless now. But the thing is, the Russians, I've read, Medvedev, when Medvedev was president of Russia, he was a moderate liberal. I mean, he wasn't Putin, who was more radical, in quotes. He never really was. But, well, compared to Medvedev. And I have a recording of a speech from that time by Medvedev saying that if the missile defense system became operational and all that, I think this was around 2008, maybe 2007, that is, if it became operational, they would be forced, before it was up and running, to launch a nuclear attack on Poland, Romania, and Spain. They were setting up the sites at that time. Luckily, the Russians, faced with this American aggression, have invented a series of systems that render this missile defense system, which isn't defensive at all, it's offensive, completely useless. It had to be thrown in the trash. The idea was this, to win a nuclear war first against the Soviets and then against the Russians. This is madness in itself. But that's the way of thinking. I recommend to everyone, as we've said many times, to watch the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, because reality is looking more and more like it. This is no longer a parody. It's realistic. It's realistic.
Every so often, a man named Theodore Postel appears on YouTube, an emeritus professor of science, technology, and international security at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's a man in his 70s who was once a leader in nuclear strategic planning at the Pentagon and also worked at Argonne National Laboratory. He's one of the most important nuclear scientists in the United States, dedicated precisely to defense and strategic planning issues until the early 2000s, when he left those positions, outraged by the internal situation and by the explicit decision of the United States to begin abandoning the treaties reached, especially during the 1980s. Since then, he has been very critical. At one point on our channel, we republished one of his talks with Pascal Lothar, our friend from the Neutrality Studies channel, a professor in Tokyo. And when asked about Trump's idea, that fantasy of a golden dome or gilded dome, I can't remember what the hell he calls it, some kind of dome.
Yes, golden dome, something like gold dome or something like that.
Gold dome, golden dome. He responds directly that the idea of intercepting intercontinental hypersonic ballistic missiles is pure fiction, through and through. Not only this dome imagined by Trump, but even the current defense systems, including the most modern ones, the famous THAAD systems, with, I don't recall, something like 10 of these batteries created so far by the United States lack much else. 2 of those 10 were delivered to Israel. According to this man, the idea of intercepting these missiles is a total absolute fallacy. In some interview somewhere, he gives an explanation. Why?
En alguna entrevista por ahí presento una explicación. ¿Por qué? Porque cada uno de estos misiles, además de
Because each one of these missiles, besides being extremely difficult to intercept due to its hypersonic speed, can very easily generate a huge number of decoys. With that, on the satellites, instead of 1, 2, or 10 missiles appearing, 1,000 missiles could show up on radar. And still, despite this madness, they create this fiction of, oh no, because if we launch the attack first, if we can respond. What madness, right? When the life of humanity is at stake. And even the lives of the very idiots who keep hammering away, creating pressure and more pressure, pushing that line further and further towards self-destruction, isn't it?
Sure, but I hope, well, I think this whole Golden Dome thing and all that is going to come to nothing. But anyway, in the event that something does happen, I expect it to be basically just an excuse to enrich the buddies of the military-industrial complex, but knowing it's not going to be useful for anything. Because really, we commission them to make things that end up being junk and serve no purpose. Because honestly, if Trump or his advisors really believe that with this Golden Dome idea, with a system, well, okay, supposedly better than the Israeli one, but we've already seen how the Israeli one works. They're going to achieve something. The Israeli system hasn't even been able to handle regular missiles. Let's see what happens with hypersonic ones, like you said, the decoy generation.
In a way, Fernando, this madness also accompanies the more visible, everyday madness of a society dreamed up by these gentlemen. The great leaders, the ruling classes, the Thiels, the Musks, naturally also the Bezoses, the Zuckerbergs, and so on. A completely impoverished, broken society, with people left to fend for themselves, while they appear protected in glass palaces, right? We see that every day, more and more, don't we? They live in their fantasy bubble, and we suffer the consequences of the society driven by these men. But in this case, well, the things tied to inequality and the impoverishment of society, within this idea of the glass bubble, create a delirious scenario. The same logic, but now, with humanity and everyone's life, even theirs, at stake, right?
But if we take into account that this is from the Cold War era, from the early days of the Cold War, the Americans had already started building bunkers so that, in the event of a nuclear war, the elite could take refuge in them and live there for who knows how many years with stored supplies and all that. This is already delusional. Okay, assuming that's the case, then you're going to come out and find a scorched earth. Well, I don't know, what are you going to do? But anyway, indeed the problem we have here is that we live in a mad world in which the globalist elites, the real elites, Trump is just a pawn, he doesn't matter. Those who truly rule and hold power are aware of one thing, and they've known this perfectly well for a long time, moreover. And more, the evidence and the data confirm it. We're heading toward a situation of scarcity. That is, especially in 2 key areas, energy and critical or strategic minerals. These include rare earths, but not only rare earths. A strategic mineral, for example, one that is very abundant, but still strategic, because without it we couldn't survive, to put it bluntly, is copper. Copper is something that everyone, and of which there is a lot, in principle. But even so, since we also consume a lot, there are going to be copper shortages in the relatively near future. Because, given the rate of extraction, even if we mined a lot, it's not enough to meet the enormous global demand for copper. Well, they know this. They know this, and they know that since there won't be enough for everyone, they'll obviously make sure they keep swimming in abundance. And how do they keep swimming in abundance? By increasing inequality. And to do that, they have to make us poorer. And on top of that, make us happy about being poor. From an energy standpoint, everything, that is, they have very powerful tools for that. And those tools are called the internet, artificial intelligence, and mobile phones. In other words, what they say in Davos, what Klaus Schwab says, him, with the unpronounceable last name, that is Schwab, Klaus Schwab, who's no longer the head of Davos because he was removed for corruption. But what he used to say, you will own nothing and be happy, actually makes a lot of sense. That is, you will own nothing because there will be scarcity. You won't be able to own anything, nor have anything, but don't worry, you'll be happy. You'll be happy through the new drugs. And what are those new drugs? Cell phones, artificial intelligence, the internet, that is, of course, virtual reality. Now we have augmented reality and so on. But when we have a virtual reality that's, let's say, quite believable, well, you'll be able to plug yourself in, you'll have your time of pleasure, because you'll live in a world made to your measure. In other words, you'll give yourself every satisfaction in the world. You'll be rich, you'll be dating the most wonderful man or woman in the world, and so on. You'll be hooked on that. That's already shown to us, in a certain sense, by The Matrix, or movies like Brainstorm, which is a great film. And well, we'll feel dominated. This is a mix between Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984. But more and more, we'll live in that proud and impoverished society. Because let's not forget, the world where the protagonists of 1984 live is an impoverished world. It's not a world of abundance. Not at all. Right? And on the other hand, the drugs they take in Brave New World, Soma and all that, those colorful pills and such, well, we can also take pills. In fact, we take them in large quantities with all the prescription drugs, the antidepressants, because we're all getting crazier by the day.
And fentanyl, Fernando, is the beginning of the fentanyl epidemic. In the face of pain, a drug, an opioid that generates physical pleasure, or at least numbs the pain, and that basically produces a zombie epidemic. Everything is starting to look more and more like a conspiracy theory, but a visible one.
But very real. Yes, yes. I mean, what we're seeing is a process in which domination by the elites is becoming absolute, and in which the rest of us, we have fewer and fewer tools to free ourselves from that domination. In other words, things look pretty grim, and with the technological tools of domination they have, tools that we ourselves already use to harm ourselves, I mean, because we need those drugs to live, whether it's the cell phone or whatever. We're already seeing, let's say, diseases. Well, conditions of people who have become addicted to their phones and can't detach from them, and who have to go to a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever, because that's already an illness, just as gambling addiction once was, or other things. We're already seeing this happen.
Fernando, dear, we wanted to present Trump's trip and the upcoming meeting between Trump and Xi, tomorrow's meeting. Because of time constraints, we won't be able to. Should we wrap up the military analysis a bit? Is there still something left to cover, or have we already presented everything?
Basically, I think we've already laid out the general idea. What we're going to see in the coming, well, days, and especially in November and December, will be major Russian advances that will cause hysteria among Europeans and Ukrainians. And let's not forget that, well, a very harsh winter is coming, one that we'll see how they get through it, but this time it can't be mitigated by sending gas, for example, from Europe. Before, the pipelines supplied gas to Europe. Now the flow is reversed, and gas is being sent from Europe, which is what we've been doing for some time. This won't fix it. I mean, everything is going to speed up very quickly. And we're going to see this, as I said, we'll start to see it next Sunday when we're back here next week.
Sobre el final, un poco de, entre comillas, humor.
Toward the end, a bit of, in quotes, humor. In fact, these are the words, the statements of one of Zelensky's opponents from Ukrainian nationalism, one of the permitted opponents, because he is perhaps even more anti-Russian than Zelensky. But he said something truly funny after the latest Russian attack on Kiev. Here is his statement from Mr. Goncharenko, a member of the Ukrainian Rada.
Diputado de la Rada ucraniana. Atención a este video difundido en su...
Pay attention to this video shared on his social media. But this hotel wasn't always called Ukraine. Until 2001, it was called Moscow. What am I getting at? Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky promised us a blackout in Moscow. Well, in this Moscow, there is a blackout. And instead of a blackout in the real Moscow, we have a total blackout in Chernihiv, in Sumy, in Kiev. People have no electricity, no fuel, no water.
Bueno, es cierto.
Well, all true. By the way, this man isn't criticizing from a pacifist standpoint. No, quite the opposite. Negotiating with Russia, he wants Zelensky's position because his stance is even more radical.
This guy is a disgrace. He's a savage. Yes, but they're criticizing Zelensky precisely because they promised a blackout in Moscow. And what they've achieved is a blackout in Kiev. And therefore, the fact that the hotel that used to be called Moscow is making this joke. But what's really important is that they're now openly admitting it. Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, they're going to be left without electricity. I don't know what he's telling you. And this is what Goncharenko is saying, and 200,000 others are saying it too. I mean, you go on Telegram and find tons of statements along these lines. So we're no longer talking about small 1-hour cuts a day. No. They're talking about entire days in some areas without electricity. And that's serious.
Fernando, qué linda la reunión de ayer con...
Fernando, what a lovely gathering yesterday with the demolition crew in Buenos Aires. People really love you, and Juan Antonio too. Everyone was like, oh, send a kiss to Fernando. Send a kiss to Juan Antonio. Juan Antonio even showed a side of himself I didn't know. The heartthrob of the more mature demolition ladies, of course. Someone even said, wow, my 80-year-old mom always watches the show. She's in love with Juan Antonio.
I get it. Because me, bald, getting fatter every day and all that, no. But Juan Antonio, who's in good shape and all, yes. I'm sure you won't admit it, but I bet when he was young, he was a heartbreaker. Ask him next time. Let's see, Juan Antonio, tell us if you were a heartbreaker when you were in your 20s and all that. I'm sure there's a dark story there that needs to be revealed at some point.
We should talk about Juan Antonio's past and have him share his youth stories. But no, seriously, people love them so much. Everyone, of course, but you and Juan Antonio even more. And so many people, I can't remember all the names now, asked to send a kiss to Fernando, to send a kiss to Juan Antonio. So many people. So well, within this whole dystopian scenario we've analyzed here, little drops of hope appear. People who support us, who practice critical thinking, who want a world a bit less deranged than this one. Let's wrap it up here, dear Fernando. To those who haven't yet helped us with a like, please support us that way, with a thumbs up against censorship, and by sharing through our MP Geopolitics channel and our English channel. On MP Geopolitics, every Friday, Fernando hosts his show, Fridays at 11 p.m.
Yes, with the daily change, it'll be a different time. I always get confused about that.
Well, 11 p.m. Madrid time, that is, 11 at night, European time, every Friday, Fernando. Now, in just a little while, in 12 minutes, Eduardo Bior with his show, who also took part yesterday, and with whom we made a spectacular team. The debates were very interesting. Dear Fernando, a hug to Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, our thanks and greetings to everyone. See you tomorrow.
Venga, hasta luego.
All right, see you later. Bye.
¿Qué?